Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at a very cool rifle from the Boer War. This is a rifle that was actually captured from the Jameson Raid. So this gives us a really cool opportunity to discuss the Jameson Raid itself and the origins of the Second Boer War. So this all kind of, this goes back centuries, but we'll start today in 1881 at the end of the First Boer War. Of course, the British, the Boers were originally Dutch farmers, Dutch immigrant farmers who settled in South Africa and just kind of wanted not a whole lot more than to be left alone and do their own sort of agrarian farming thing. Well, this gets interrupted periodically when things like giant diamond deposits are discovered in South Africa, and the British Empire takes a keen interest in such things. There's a lot of tension back and forth. Ultimately, you end up with the British Cape Colony in southern South Africa, and then two major Boer republics, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, ZAR, Zuid-Afrikaner Republic. And in 1880 and 1881, they have the First Boer War against the British. The British probably have the capability to fully quash the Boer armies. They are frontier militia sort of armies. They don't have a lot of the logistical support that a professional British army does, but the British don't really want to get overextended and overcommit to this, and the Boers do really well for themselves picking apart the British with guerrilla type tactics. So they come to an agreement. Basically, these two Boer republics are allowed sovereignty, a principle of suzerainty, where they get full internal independence and self-control and sovereignty, but the British Empire kind of gets to dictate their foreign policy. And to the Boers, I think that was just fine. They didn't really want to deal with the outside world so much anyway. So they agree to that. It's all good, except that 2 years later, massive gold deposits are discovered. One of the overall, probably the richest gold find in the world shows up in the Boer republics. So what happens there? Well, of course, mining companies flood in, huge mining operations are set up, and these are actually, the work is actually done largely by British immigrants from South Africa who, hey, here's this great new job opportunity just a little bit up north, go up there, get some jobs. The Boers were, like I said, agrarian farmers. They were not industrialized. They didn't have any particularly huge cities. There were cities, obviously, but not thriving metropolis type cities, until these gold deposits result in this huge influx of immigrant British miners. And these guys outnumber the Boers, and the Boers kind of do what you might expect from a population that finds themselves potentially under threat in this way. They heavily restrict the voting franchise. You have to be a Boer citizen to vote. Okay, that makes sense. But it takes a long time to become one. You have to be in the country for a whole bunch of years. They want to make sure that these immigrant miners aren't able to immediately gain the franchise and then take over the government and basically kick the Boers out because these miners are in the majority. The Boers also, of course, take advantage of this situation by putting some pretty heavy taxes on all of the mining industry, workers and companies alike. So British miners, British interests, mining company interests aren't thrilled about this. They would much rather have the British in control of these countries because the British are going to let them do a lot more and let them profit a lot more. So there are some plans set up of, okay, how can we get the British to come in here and just annex this? This is what we did with the diamonds. It worked well enough. Just have them do it again. And the idea that kind of emerged was we'll set up some committees of mine workers in the ZAR. And when they get fed up, they'll revolt. There'll be public disorder and riots, and we'll have supplied, we'll have some guns stashed that we can equip them with, and then we can send in a force to stand up for the rights of these abused British subjects, British citizens, and then we can call in the British government and say, look, this is, there's terrible unrest, the British, your British citizens here are being abused. You should come in, restore order, and maybe while you're at it, just take over the whole government. And to support this, they set up these committees for resistance in Johannesburg, And then they also organized what was going to be a military raiding party that would go in under the command of one Leander Jameson. And I think the original idea was that he wasn't going to do this until there was already unrest that he could support, but he kind of got impatient and decided to leave early. Didn't plan it out all that well. His communication with some of the planners in the Cape Colony and possibly in England didn't go as smoothly as it should have. He ends up going off before anyone else thinks that he ought to. December 29th, 1895, he sets off. And he's got like 600 men. They've got a dozen Maxim guns, half a dozen pieces of artillery. This is a fairly serious military expedition. And when he sets off, the idea is this will be a surprise attack. He and his men will show up in Johannesburg, overwhelm the city defenses, and kind of take over and then be able to bring the British in. Well, the problem is they planned to cut all the telegraph lines when they set off so that no one could warn the Boers that they were coming. Well, they missed one. Telephone lines being what they were, there was one line that they missed and they accidentally cut a fence instead. And so it turns out the Boers knew that they were coming from the moment that they set foot on the road. Boers waited, set up an ambush at a place called Doornkop, and just annihilated the Jameson Raid. They were completely surrounded, completely outclassed, and they surrendered. And the Boers here captured all of their machine guns and all of their artillery and about 500 really nice Lee rifles, including this one. Jameson and his group may have mucked up their planning a bit, but they got the armaments right. This was some top-of-the-line stuff in 1895. This is a Lee Speed rifle, which is the commercial production version of the Lee-Metford. There are a number of interesting features here. Because this rifle was captured and kept intact, it's a really cool time capsule of what these rifles actually looked like at the time. Lee-Metfords in British service have largely been updated over the years to newer and newer models and no longer have those original characteristics. So right off the bat, you'll note there's a little cut off here, or a little cut out here for the cut off. It does have a magazine cutoff. This, you'll also notice, does not accommodate stripper clips. This was the predecessor to the magazine Lee Enfield rifles. This was before they had actually developed the 5-round charger or stripper clip for them. So, in addition, the magazine, while it looks like a standard Lee Enfield magazine, it is actually a single feed, double stack, single feed magazine, and this only holds 8 rounds instead of the later 10 because it has to narrow to a single stack at the top. That's kind of interesting. And then these magazines, of course, had to be loaded one at a time by hand because there were no stripper clips to feed them with. And then, of course, you could load the magazine, engage the cutoff, and then feed rounds singly, one at a time, until you needed the magazine, at which point you can pull this cutoff out and then feed your 8 rounds from the magazine. The Lee action is basically the same as they would continue to use all the way through the number 4. There's a cock on close action. Interestingly, like the early Lee-Metfords, it has no manual safety on it, although there is a cutout in the stock for one. You do have a volley sight here. This is for when you need to go farther than the standard rear sight will take you, and the rear sight goes out to 1,600 yards. You've got 300 and 400 there using this notch, and then you can lift this sight up to go out from 500 and all the way up to 16, like so, of course. Then, when you need to go farther, you would rotate this out. This one's really tight in there, and I don't know if that's pushing into the wood. I don't want to damage it, but this acts as your front sight, and so at relatively close range, it starts up here, and as you rotate it all the way around to the bottom, it goes out as far as, I believe, 3,500 yards. So that's the front. This is your aperture rear sight for the volley, so that goes high, the front sight goes low, and that gives you a very steep angle firing up into the air to get out 3,500 yards. We have the early pattern of muzzle out here, cleaning rod, bayonet lug, little barleycorn style front sight. And of course, Metford rifling, which is basically oval grooves. Instead of having square-edged rifling, it has rounded edge rifling. Some guys really preferred that because it was easier to clean. You didn't get fouling right down in the crevice of the corners of the rifling. One of the coolest elements on this rifle, though, is the carving in the buttstock. The Boers actually encouraged their men to do things like this, to personalize their rifles. And part of the reason for that was the Boers didn't really issue rifles in the way that a modern military does. They had an independent citizen militia sort of military, and when you showed up, you had to provide your own horse and your own rifle. Now, in the lead up to the Second Boer War, the ZAR and OVS governments did have programs to supply rifles to men who needed them, who were too poor to have a good rifle, that sort of thing. And so there were ways that you could basically buy one on loan from the government or such things, but they weren't government property. They ultimately became your own personal property as a Boer soldier. And so you're not defacing government property by doing something like this. It's yours. And so there's a lot of carving. In fact, this particular rifle is documented in the book Carvings from the Veldt, which is, it's actually 3 volumes on the various types of carving on Boer War rifles. So a very cool book if you're interested in that sort of thing. And like I said, that book has this specific rifle documented, which is a great addition to its provenance. Now, this guy is not the guy who was captured in the Jameson Raid. Instead, those 500 rifles that the Boers captured ended up being distributed out to guys who needed better rifles. And so this went to a Boer by the name of J.W. Rossau. Unfortunately, I was not able to find any particular record of him or where he came from, but he carved his name into this and used it through the war. I have another video on the Lee Speed if you're interested in it. The short version is Joseph Speed was in charge of the Royal Small Arms factory at Enfield and had a significant hand in refining a lot of the elements of the Lee rifle for British service. So when these were sold commercially, he owned a bunch of patents on the gun, and so his name was added to it. Lee, of course, was the progenitor of the magazine and the bolt system, and then Speed also had a hand in the development, and so they both got royalties from the commercial sales of the rifles. So I know I went a bit long on the general history here today instead of the rifle itself, but really the significance of this rifle is primarily that it was so specifically and directly involved in one of the really interesting pivotal events in the build-up to the Second Boer War. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you'd like to know more about the Rock Island Auction Company, you can follow them on YouTube and Instagram. If you take a look at the description text below, you'll find links to their video channel and their Instagram page, both down there. Thanks for watching.